brother, sister. There's a moment in almost every argument with your spouse where you can feel the words forming before they leave your mouth. Words you already know will do real damage, but that feels strangely satisfying to say, anyway, in the heat of the moment. Scripture says the tongue has the power of life and death, and nowhere is that more true than inside a marriage, where words spoken in a single moment of anger get remembered years after the argument itself has long since been forgotten by everyone else. The specific fight rarely matters much in the long run. What actually lingers is what was said in the middle of it. Today we're naming 6 things you must never say to your spouse in an argument, however true they might feel in the moment, however tempting they are to reach for when the disagreement is already escalating. This isn't about suppressing real conflict or pretending disagreement doesn't belong in a healthy marriage. It's about fighting fair, even when everything in you wants to fight to win. Stay with me. You may recognize a few of these from your own mouth. Think about your last real argument with your spouse. Not the topic itself, but the specific words you reached for once the disagreement started escalating. Try to remember exactly what you said, word for word, rather than the softened, more forgivable version you'd probably tell a friend about it afterward. That honest memory is exactly where this conversation needs to start. Because most of us remember the argument's subject far more clearly and comfortably than we remember precisely what we actually said in the heat of the middle of it. The first thing you must never say is absolute language. You always. You never. You always do this. You never listen to me. These phrases feel completely accurate in the heat of an argument, but they're rarely actually true, and your spouse usually knows it the moment they hear it spoken aloud. Absolute language doesn't just exaggerate the specific complaint. It erases every counterexample, every time they actually did listen, actually did show up, actually did get it right. Once always and never enter an argument, the conversation stops being about the actual issue and starts being about defending against an impossible, sweeping accusation. Notice what actually happens the moment those words are spoken. Your spouse, instead of engaging honestly with the specific complaint, now has to defend their entire pattern of behavior against a claim that isn't even technically true. The argument has been hijacked, moving from something addressable, a specific missed conversation, a specific broken promise, into something impossible to resolve, because no one can disprove an absolute claim in the middle of a heated moment. Precision in your language isn't just more accurate. It actually keeps the argument solvable. The second thing you must never say is a threat to leave or end the marriage, used as a weapon in the middle of a fight. Maybe we shouldn't even be married. I don't know why I even stay anymore. These words might be spoken out of pure frustration, with no real intention behind them at all, but your spouse can't actually read your intentions in that moment. They can only hear the words themselves, exactly as they were spoken. Using the possibility of divorce as leverage in an argument introduces a kind of instability that lingers long after the specific fight has ended. Marriage was meant to be a covenant, not a bargaining chip pulled out whenever an argument gets difficult enough. Consider what this threat actually teaches your spouse over time, even if you never once meant it literally. Each time the possibility of leaving gets raised as leverage, it quietly erodes the sense of safety a marriage is supposed to provide. The confidence that no matter how heated a disagreement gets, the relationship itself isn't actually on the table. Repeated often enough, this threat can train your spouse to walk on eggshells during every future disagreement, bracing for the same words to resurface again. The third thing you must never say is bringing up old wounds and past failures purely as ammunition. This is just like that time you, followed by something specific from years ago, something already fully apologized for, something that genuinely had nothing to do with the actual argument happening right now. Old wounds resurface in arguments because they're effective weapons, not because they're relevant to the current disagreement. But every time an old failure gets weaponized this way, it teaches your spouse that past mistakes are never actually forgiven. They're simply being stored up for the next available fight. Think about how this pattern actually changes your spouse's willingness to be honest with you over time. If every confession, every apology, every past mistake becomes potential ammunition for a future argument, your spouse learns to hide rather than to be vulnerable, precisely because vulnerability has proven costly before. A marriage where the past can always resurface as a weapon slowly teaches both people to guard themselves rather than to fully open up, which is the exact opposite of what genuine intimacy actually requires. The fourth thing you must never say is an unfavorable comparison to someone else, an ex, a friend's spouse, even a parent. My ex never would have done this. Why can't you be more like? These comparisons cut in a way few other words can block, because they don't just critique a specific action, They suggest your spouse is fundamentally inadequate compared to someone else entirely. Comparison has no legitimate place in a marriage argument. It doesn't clarify the actual issue. It simply adds humiliation to whatever the disagreement was already about. Consider what a comparison like this actually communicates beneath the surface. Not just criticism of a specific action, but the suggestion that your spouse is fundamentally replaceable, that someone else would have handled this better simply by being a different person entirely. That message tends to land far deeper and linger far longer than whatever the original disagreement was actually about, turning a solvable conflict into a wound about their basic worth in the relationship. The fifth thing you must never say is an attack on your spouse's character or identity rather than the specific behavior in front of you. You're just like your mother. You're so selfish. These statements move the argument away from a specific, addressable action and toward a permanent, identity-level accusation. There's a real difference between saying, "That hurt me," and saying, "You are a hurtful person." One names a moment, the other names an entire identity, and identity-level attacks are exactly the kind of wound that takes years to fully heal, if it ever does. Notice how differently these two kinds of statements actually function in practice. A behavior-focused complaint gives your spouse something specific to change, something addressable and concrete. An identity-focused attack gives them nothing to actually fix, because you haven't named an action. You've named who they supposedly are at their core. That kind of accusation tends to get absorbed rather than corrected, quietly shaping how your spouse sees themselves long after the specific argument has been forgotten. And the sixth, maybe the most corrosive of all, words driven by contempt, where winning the argument matters more than the actual relationship. Mockery, eye-rolling condescension, "I don't even care anymore." These aren't really arguments at all. They're a form of dismissal, treating your spouse as an opponent to be defeated rather than a partner to be understood. Contempt has been identified, again and again, as one of the most corrosive patterns a marriage can develop, precisely because it communicates something far worse than anger. It communicates that your spouse isn't even worth genuinely engaging with anymore. Consider the specific danger of this particular pattern compared to the other five. Anger, however painful, still treats your spouse as someone worth arguing with, someone whose perspective matters enough to fight over. Contempt does something quieter and more dangerous. It communicates disengagement disguised as superiority, the sense that your spouse's feelings, arguments, and perspective aren't even worth taking seriously anymore. A marriage can often recover from anger. Contempt, left unaddressed, tends to erode the relationship far more slowly and far more completely. So what does it actually look like to argue well, without reaching for any of these 6 weapons? It looks like sticking to the specific issue instead of reaching for absolute language. It looks like never using the relationship itself as leverage in a disagreement. It looks like leaving old wounds in the past once they've genuinely been addressed. It looks like refusing comparison entirely, however tempting it becomes. It looks like naming behavior instead of attacking character. And it looks like staying genuinely engaged with your spouse, even in disagreement, rather than slipping into contempt. None of this means every argument needs to be calm or quiet. Real conflict, honestly worked through, is part of a healthy marriage, and suppressing genuine disagreement out of fear is its own kind of unhealthy pattern. But how you fight matters just as much as what you're fighting about, and words spoken in anger have a way of outlasting the argument that produced them by years, sometimes by decades, long after the original topic has been completely forgotten by both people involved. So the next time you feel one of these 6 phrases rising up in the heat of an argument, pause before it leaves your mouth. Ask whether you actually want to win, or whether you want to stay married to the person standing in front of you. Here's a simple practice that can help in the actual heat of the moment, when these words are already forming. If you notice yourself reaching for absolute language, pause and name the specific instance instead. Not "you always," but "this morning, when this specific thing happened." If you feel the threat of leaving rising to your lips, stop and say instead something honest about your frustration without weaponizing the relationship itself. "I'm so frustrated I don't know what to do with it," rather than questioning the marriage. If an old wound surfaces, ask yourself honestly whether it's actually relevant to the current disagreement, or whether you're simply reaching for something that will hurt more effectively. If a comparison forms, let it die in your mind rather than your mouth. No one has ever felt closer to their spouse after being compared unfavorably to someone else. If you're about to attack character rather than behavior, try rephrasing the sentence to start with "I felt" instead of "you are." And if you notice contempt creeping into your tone, the eye roll, the dismissive sigh, that's often the clearest signal that the conversation needs an actual pause rather than continued engagement. None of these 6 practices make disagreement disappear from a marriage, and that's not actually the goal. Healthy marriages still argue, sometimes intensely, about real and important things. The goal was never conflict-free harmony. It was learning to fight in a way that leaves the relationship intact afterward, rather than accumulating wounds that outlast whatever the argument was actually about. Consider how differently a marriage feels over the years when these 6 patterns are genuinely absent, compared to one where they've become a normal part of every disagreement. In the first, conflict resolves and actually strengthens the relationship over time, because both people know the fighting itself has limits. In the second, each argument adds a little more accumulated damage, until eventually the sheer weight of everything said in anger becomes its own separate wound, disconnected from any of the original disagreements that produced it. If this stirred something in you, brother, sister, don't scroll past it. Subscribe to Biblical Warning now, and let's keep examining these hidden places together, one warning at a time.